Imagine sitting down to dinner in 1890, but the steak is dyed with coal tar and the milk is preserved with formaldehyde. During the Gilded Age, the American dinner table was a literal minefield. Corporations prioritized profit over human lives, turning citizens into unwitting lab rats. But one man decided to fight back using a method so dangerous it seems like a horror story. He recruited young men to eat poison for science. This was the birth of the Poison Squad. But why did the government allow such a lethal game? And who was really pulling the strings in the shadows of Washington? By the late 1800s, America was transforming from a rural nation into an industrial powerhouse. But this growth came with a hidden cost. Fresh food was notoriously hard to transport across vast distances, so chemistry stepped in to fill the gap. Companies used copper sulfate to make peas look greener and salicylic acid to stop rot. There were no labels, no inspections, and absolutely no laws to stop them. It was a golden era for fraudsters. If a product smelled like decay, they simply masked it with a chemical cocktail. This wasn't just corporate negligence, it was a systematic poisoning of the public. Consumers were buying pure honey that was actually corn syrup and potted ham that contained little more than floor sweepings. But the question is, how could an entire nation ignore the mounting pile of bodies? The answer lies in the deep pockets of the food lobby. In a world without regulations, the pursuit of gold had turned the American kitchen into a laboratory of death. Enter Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, a man whose obsession with purity would make him the most hated individual in the food industry. As the chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry, Wiley spent years analyzing food samples in his basement lab. What he found was terrifying. He saw honey that was nothing but glucose and coffee made of charred ground peas. Wiley realized that data alone wouldn't change the law. He needed something more dramatic, something that would shock the American conscience. He wasn't just a scientist, he was a political operative in a lab coat. Wiley knew that the lobbyists in Washington were telling Congress that these chemicals were harmless in small doses. To prove them wrong, he decided to turn the government itself into a testing ground. But could one man really take on the titans of industry? Wiley knew he needed evidence that was impossible to ignore. He needed a group of volunteers willing to put their lives on the line to expose the toxic truth. In 1902, Wiley launched an experiment that would be unthinkable today. He recruited 12 young, healthy government clerks who agreed to eat all their meals in the basement dining room. They were nicknamed the Poison Squad. These men signed waivers acknowledging the risks, including the risk of permanent injury or death. For $5 a month and free meals, they became human filters for the industrial toxins of the age. They were monitored constantly. Their weight, their pulse, and even their waste were analyzed daily by a team of chemists. It was a clinical study disguised as a dinner party. The men were divided into groups, some receiving the additives while others acted as the control. However, as the first doses of borax were administered, the atmosphere in the basement changed. The jovial mood of the young clerks began to sour as the reality of their situation set in. But what happens when the very food meant to sustain you begins to slowly shut down your organs? The first chemical on the menu was borax, a common cleaner used by meat packers to keep rotting beef from smelling rancid. At first, the men felt fine, but as the weeks passed, the symptoms became undeniable. Headaches, stomach pains, and a persistent crushing fatigue took hold of the group. Some men became so ill they couldn't even stand, yet Wiley pushed them further. He moved on to salicylic acid, sulfuric acid, and the most feared of all, formaldehyde. The public became obsessed with the daily reports coming out of the hygienic table. Songs were written about them, and newspapers treated the volunteers like gladiators in a modern arena. The squad became a national symbol of the battle against corporate greed. But behind the media circus, a dark reality was emerging. The chemicals weren't just preservatives, they were slow acting killers that were present in almost every American home. As the health of the volunteers deteriorated, Wiley had the evidence he needed. But the question remained: would the politicians in Washington care more about human lives or campaign contributions? As Wiley's findings gained traction, the food industry didn't just sit back, they launched a massive smear campaign. They called Wiley a crank and a faddist who was trying to destroy the American economy. Powerful senators whose campaigns were funded by meat packers and syrup manufacturers blocked every attempt at reform. This was a classic Gilded Age power play. Money wasn't just talking, it was shouting. The lobbyists argued that if chemicals were banned, food prices would skyrocket and the poor would starve. It was a calculated use of fear to protect profit margins. They even attempted to discredit the poison squad itself, claiming the men were faking their illnesses for attention. For years, every bill introduced to regulate food safety died in committee. The industrial titans seemed invincible, protected by a wall of corrupt officials and deceptive marketing. But then, the political landscape shifted in a way no one expected. A new kind of journalism was rising, and it was about to expose the rot that Wiley's chemicals couldn't hide. While Wiley fought in the labs, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the streets. Reports of embalmed beef during the Spanish American War had already sickened the public. Hundreds of soldiers had died from bad meat rather than enemy bullets. Then came Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Sinclair intended to write about worker rights, but the public only cared about the descriptions of rats being ground into sausages and workers falling into rendering vats. Suddenly, the Poison Squad's scientific data had a visceral, nauseating face. People realized the strawberry jam they fed their children was actually coal tar and wood seeds. The outrage was no longer just academic, it was a full blown national panic. Housewives' leagues and consumer groups began to march, demanding to know what was in their food. The question was, would President Theodore Roosevelt finally step in, or would he succumb to the pressure of his wealthy donors? The president, a man of action, was reportedly so disgusted by Sinclair's book that he threw his breakfast out the window. The pressure became too much to ignore. In 1906, after decades of struggle, the Pure Food and Drug Act was finally signed into law. It was a landmark moment for consumer protection, but it was far from a total victory. The lobbyists managed to water down many of the provisions, ensuring that regulation didn't always mean abolition. They fought for loopholes that allowed them to keep using certain additives if they were listed on the label in tiny print. Even after the law passed, Wiley found himself under constant attack. His enemies tried to have him fired multiple times, claiming he was overstepping his authority and damaging American business. It was a brutal reminder that passing a law is only half the battle. The other half is the constant, exhausting work of enforcement against those who believe they are above the law. Wiley spent the rest of his career fighting to ensure the act wasn't ignored by the very agencies meant to uphold it. He had won the war, but the occupation of the industry would take decades more. Dr. Harvey Wiley eventually resigned in 1912, frustrated by the compromises he was forced to make. But his legacy is everywhere. Every time you read a nutrition label or see a use by date, you are seeing the results of the Poison Squad sacrifice. They prove that the government has a fundamental duty to protect its citizens from corporate greed. However, the battle isn't over. Today, we face new chemical additives, microplastics, and complex global supply chains that Wiley could never have imagined. History teaches us that the line between safety and profit is always being tested by those who seek to maximize the latter. The Poison Squad showed us that change requires more than just facts. It requires courage and a willingness to confront the powerful. So, the final question remains: who is watching our dinner tables today? And are we still in some way part of an ongoing experiment? Perhaps the most eerie truth of all is that the battle for what we consume is a fight that never truly ends. Thank you for joining us on this investigative journey into the dark history of the American dinner table. If you found the story of the Poison Squad as chilling as we did, please subscribe to the Eerie Historian for more deep dives into the scandals and secrets that shaped our world. Don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember that history is rarely as clean as the book suggests.